My name is Donna Halper, and I'm a media historian. And the thing that I love to do more than anything else in the world is tell the stories of people who have been forgotten and written out of history. My expertise, of course, is in the history of broadcasting. And one of the areas that I've been doing a lot of research about is the women of amateur radio and the women of early broadcasting. And this is a story that fascinates me because in many cases, they've really been written out of history entirely. In fact, I wrote an entire book called Invisible Stars, A Social History of Women in American Broadcasting, but that was mostly about like broadcasting. And I started doing research on amateur radio because the early stations very often were operated by amateurs. And you had to have a ham radio license to be able to do broadcasting in those early days. Long story, but the bottom line is if the ships at sea needed to get through and they needed to use the frequency, or if something else went wrong, they very often needed an amateur there, somebody who understood engineering and who could fix stuff. And as it turned out, some of those people were women. There were also other roles for women in early amateur radio, and I want to talk a little bit about them now. So, assuming things are working, and I hope they are, welcome to a conversation about the women of early amateur radio. Now, on the cover here of my talk, we have Mae Smith. And please accept the apologies for the bad quality of some of these photographs. They're very old, they're very rare, and in some cases, they're one of a kind, and they're not as clear as I'd like, but I'm just glad to have anything at all. This is Mae Lillian Smith. She was from Manchester, New Hampshire, and her call letters were 1DBE, and later 1BAE. She was born in 1867. She lived till 1952. And I first came upon her in Radio News magazine when in 1920, in August of 1920, her station was named the Station of the Month. And Hugo Gernsback, who edited the magazine, was kind of like, a woman with a radio set, and she built it herself. Turns out there were a lot more Mae Smiths out there. But we start off with Mae just because she was somebody who stayed in amateur radio. She did not try to get into commercial radio, but a lot of New Englanders knew her. They knew her work. They knew her set building skills, and they knew about her love of amateur radio. Unfortunately, she wasn't mentioned a whole lot. More common was this kind of image from the September 20th radio news. It's a thing called Teaching Her Wireless. And of course, we have the young man in a tuxedo, because of course, when you're teaching someone wireless, you wear a tuxedo, guys, am I right? And he's teaching his girlfriend or significant other how to use the Morse code key. And more likely, the implication is they're going to be spending more time, hugging and kissing than learning wireless, because the common stereotype was that amateur radio was just way too complicated for women. They couldn't possibly learn it. By all accounts, Mae Smith learned it and she taught herself. But that wasn't the common image. So you will find a number of covers in radio magazines of the early 1920s where the young woman is more interested in her boyfriend than in learning amateur radio. But also the myth is that she can't learn amateur radio and eventually she'll just give up. Oh, my friends, nothing could be farther from the truth. Let's start here. This is Edith Rotch, a very young Edith Rotch, and you notice she's wearing a bizarre looking hat. That's because this picture was taken back in her figure skating days. Edith Rotch never planned on becoming an amateur. She was a star tennis player. She graduated from Radcliffe in 1901, magna cum laude. Back in those days, Harvard was gender segregated. Women couldn't go there. So if you were an upper class woman, which Edith Rotch was, Edith Elliott Rotch, she was one of the Elliots, which was an upper class family. And Edith Elliott Rotch went to Radcliffe, did extremely well, and then became a tennis champion. 1908, 1909, 1910. You can look her up. She's winning all kinds of tennis competitions. And like I said, she was also a local figure skater. But during the First World War, which back then, of course, was not called the First World War because nobody knew there was going to be a second one. So during the Great War, as it was then called, a lot of women got involved in amateur broadcasting because a lot of the guys were heading overseas and there are openings. You can get a good job as an amateur radio operator, as an operator helping out the troops, as an operator working for the telegraph company. There were already telegraphers who were women. I'll talk about them in a minute. But I wanted to talk about Edith because she exemplifies a number of women who first decided to learn Morse code and help out to help her country. So she gets her license and she starts teaching women how to be ham radio operators so that they can do the variety of things that require an amateur operator. And some of these women parlayed that into full-time jobs with pay for companies like Western Union and the Postal Service and the railroads and things of that nature. Edith stayed local. Her call letters were 1RO, later 1ZR. And when I first came on, you probably saw this image. This is a rare photograph of her around 1924. Again, the set in the picture, she was responsible for building it based on what I've researched. She remained involved in amateur radio for decades. In fact, when she died in 1969, she was still going to ham radio meetings right up until the very last. She was a passionate amateur radio fan and a passionate participant in amateur radio. She even became a radio inspector. She gave the code exams to people, both male and female. So she was widely admired in Massachusetts. And up in Connecticut, the same thing. We had Cecil Powell, okay? She was the assistant to Hiram Maxim, of course, the founder of the ARRL. And she also, like Edith Rotch, got her amateur calls and became a ham in 1916, 1917 to help the war effort. She was, by some accounts, the first woman to be licensed as an amateur radio operator in the state of Connecticut. And from that time on, she would come down to Boston and give exams to women who wanted to get licensed. And the newspapers wrote up the fact that every single exam she gave, all of the participants in her classes passed. And not because she gave them anything. She was, by all accounts, very, very rigorous. Now, she remained involved in amateur radio for a while, but then she refocused her efforts on working for Mr. Maxim. She started off as his executive assistant, what today we would call a secretary, but gradually worked her way up to the point where she was the secretary treasurer of his company. And there she stayed till her death. She was a very, very influential early amateur. And without her and Edith Rotch, not as many women would have probably felt comfortable seeking out the opportunity to help their country during the war, and many of those women stuck around. Now, here's somebody that some of you are very familiar with. I was having a conversation with Lynn from the AWA the other day, and his wife wrote an article about this woman, and it made me interested to try to find out what I could about her life. This is Mary Macauley, and she was a press telegrapher. Now, I know what you're thinking. Donna, this is supposed to be about like the early women of amateur radio and the women that were involved in broadcasting. Yeah, but Mary Macaulay's a very interesting story. And one of the things that is interesting about her is she only went to school till she was 14. But because of the fact that she found Morse code and amateur radio, she was able to work her way into a very good job with Western Union as a telegrapher. And ultimately, she became a press telegrapher. She worked for a number of newspapers because back in those days, before broadcasting, before like radio as we know it, before the telephone was in every city, telegraphers were a lifeline. Reporters depended on them because reporters would send their stories to the newspaper, and there had to be telegraphers there who knew how to transcribe the story into English so that the average person could read it and it would end up in the newspaper. This was Mary Macaulay's expertise. She was fast, she was accurate, she was also very outspoken. She believed in equal rights for women, she believed in women's suffrage, and of course, suffrage was an old word from the word permission. She wanted women to have permission to vote. She was very active in her union. And the other thing that I found interesting is, and Lynn's wife mentioned this in an article that she wrote, Mary Macaulay became the telegrapher for a very famous person, Susan B. Anthony, who was a widely known suffragist. Now, back in those days, reporters and famous people all had their own telegraphers, but most of the men, because of the customs of that day, they didn't want to travel with a woman because it wouldn't have looked right. So the men traveled on the road with men telegraphers, and famous women had women telegraphers. And Mary Macaulay was one of those. She was widely known, widely respected. From 1902 to 1927, she did most of her work for newspapers in the Lockport area, in the Rochester area. There are so many newspaper articles that never would have worked it into the paper if it weren't for Mary Macaulay. Now, here's a question that many people ask. Is this a picture of the first two broadcasters? And when I say broadcasters, I mean people who may have started off in amateur radio, but ultimately did broadcasting. They were heard by a wide audience. They reached out to those people with voice and music and news. And Doc Herrold and his then wife, Sybil, were at the Herrold College of Wireless, which was a thing. It was a real school in San Jose, California. And Sybil did her own program. She took requests. She did dedications. How did she do that, Donna? Well, people would send in telegrams, which, by the way, in the early years of broadcasting, that was very common. As I said, not every city had a telephone, so it wasn't like, I'll take the 8th caller. You couldn't take the 8th caller. They may not have a phone. So people would send in telegrams or even letters. She was on once a week from about 1914 to 1916, from what we can gather. She may have been on in 1913. I've seen some sources saying that, but I have verified it from 1914 to 1916. And she was on the Herrold College of Wireless radio station, but she also was an amateur. She taught Morse code, and she was widely known and widely respected in her day. And many people, including my friend Mike Adams, who wrote a book about this, have said that Doc Herrold and Sybil Herrold were probably the first broadcasters way back in that 1913, 14, 15, 16 era. Now here's my cultural hero. This is, of course, the late, great Eunice Randall. I first found out about Eunice completely accidentally. I was looking for something else back in the day when you went through the old microfilm, as many of us are quite familiar. Not everything was digitized then or now. But back when I first started doing this research, nothing was digitized at all because the internet wasn't a thing yet. Yes, I'm that old, but still young and cute. The fact is, though, that I was looking for something else entirely, and I was reading Guy Entwistle's column. I know what you're thinking. Who's Guy Entwistle? Well, in the very, very early days of radio, 1920, 1921, most newspapers ignored it because they saw it as competition. But a few newspapers embraced radio, and they hired radio editors to write about it. And Guy Entwistle worked for the Boston Traveler, long gone and hard to find. But it lives on in microfilm, and it's semi-digitized. It's not a complete run, but some of it is digitized. The point is, I was looking for some information about Boston's pioneering radio station, which went on the air as 1XE because it was considered experimental, and it later took the call letters WGI in February of 1922. So I was looking for information about it, and somewhere along the line, I saw a column, because Guy Entwistle had a radio column 3 days a week in the Traveler, and it mentioned the lady announcer, Eunice Randall, is having a birthday. And I went, lady announcer? This is a thing that exists? Because I hadn't read about any lady announcers. Turns out Eunice was possibly the first in the East, and one of the only in the United States when she first began broadcasting circa 1919, okay, after the war ended. Eunice remained on the air for about 6 years. Prior to that, she worked behind the scenes at the Amrad plant, manufacturing radio sets and doing drafting. She was a drafts lady, as she liked to be called. Some of the stuff in this photo, and by the way, it's posed, but some of the stuff in it, she built. So I started looking up more stuff about Eunice because I was curious about the lady announcer. And that's how I found her. And that's how I became determined to tell her story. Eunice absolutely started out as an amateur. She was ER when she first began. She was then 1 CDP, and later she was W1 MPP, or as she jokingly called it, W1 Madam Picklepuss. She remained active in amateur radio for more than 4 decades. And in fact, she was the president of the Southeastern Massachusetts Radio Association. She also, after her marriage in 1948, moved up to Maine and started the Barnyard Network, which was a ham radio network for blind people. She was sighted, but she ran into an awful lot of people who were not, and they loved amateur radio. And so she set up a network for them, and she operated that network. She remained very, very involved in ham radio almost till the day she died. And as I've said in other talks, one of the things that just irritates me is the fact that when I went looking in history of broadcasting textbooks, no Eunice at all, no Edith Rotch, no Cecil Powell, no any of the early amateurs who had a foot in commercial broadcasting, nothing. You'd think they weren't even there. Eunice at 1XEWGI was able to do some engineering. She was able to do some announcing. She was able to be the story lady. She was able to do news. She was a pioneer. And I'm proud of the fact that she is now mentioned in some history of broadcasting books. I've worked hard to get that to happen. I'm not the only one, but I'm glad that I was able to make people more aware of her because, as I said, the myth is, oh, women were just like somebody's girlfriend. Now, don't get me wrong. Nothing wrong with being somebody's girlfriend. But my research has found that that's not the story for everyone. Some women just found amateur radio, became fascinated, and decided they would pursue it wherever it led. I was asked in a talk that I tried desperately to give at the AWA conference, which, don't ask, some days technology works, some days it doesn't. I'm glad it's working today. I was asked about Mary Texanna Loomis. She was 3YA, and she broadcast from the Loomis Radio School, which was a thing. It was in Washington, D.C. Now, she was passionate about amateur radio. She built sets, she taught Morse code, and then in 1920, after, like some other women I've mentioned, getting involved in the war effort, she decided to open a radio school. She was nationally known in her day as the only woman operating a radio school. But here's what puzzles me. While it's really impressive that she operated this radio school, and many of her graduates went on to important careers as engineers, as telegraphers, as broadcasters, commercial broadcasters. And yet, Mary Texanna Loomis had one requirement to get into her school, in addition to passing the test. You had to be a guy. She would not admit women into her school. People tried to nail her down on why she wouldn't. It seemed to boil down to her belief that men were going to be the ones that supported their family or something. But it still seemed kind of strange to those of us years later. I mean, at the time, it was probably considered, well, that's the norm. Most women don't get involved in these things. But shouldn't they have at least been allowed to try? But Mary Texanna Loomis would not admit women to her school. And like I said, if I had ever interviewed her, I certainly would have asked about that. But still, there is no taking away from the fact that in her day, she was a very influential person, because people really did come from all over the world to study with her. We have evidence that there were people from countries as far away as Europe, the Middle East, South America. And as I said, she was written up in a number of newspapers. So here's somebody else that I think is pretty commendable. This is Elizabeth Zandonini, better known as Liz Zandonini. She went on the air as an amateur as 3CDQ. And by the way, if you're wondering, if you're not into ham radio history and you're saying, where's the W? That didn't really start happening till 1927, 28. Prior to that, you just got the number, which identified what region of the country you were in, and then you got your call letters. So she was 3CDQ, And then later on, she was W3 CDQ. Now, Liz Zandonini was a radio aide at what was then called the National Bureau of Standards. She worked in the radio propagation division, okay? And she did experiments in radio propagation and how far signals traveled and stuff like that. She also traveled to various parts of the world exploring those sorts of things. She was written up quite a lot in ham radio journals, but in other places, not so much. What's interesting to me about Liz Zandonini is, unlike other women of her era, including Eunice Randall, Liz would not use voice. She loved the Continental Code. She loved Morse code, okay? And this is how she communicated for decades with people all over the world. And I don't know why she didn't like to use voice, but by all accounts, she had a perfectly nice voice. She gave a number of talks on radio propagation, but she continued to use code and became quite good at it and became widely respected for doing so. There's a lot of evidence that she and Eunice Randall knew each other. I think the women that operated in amateur radio back then, whether they went on to commercial broadcasting or not, were kind of like a sorority, kind of like a sisterhood. And I wouldn't be surprised if they knew Edith Rotch, et cetera, et cetera. So Liz Zandonini, she lived a long life and was interested in radio till the very end. Now, it wouldn't be a talk if I didn't mention some of the guys, because let's be honest, in an era, the late 1800s, early 1900s, where by and large, most amateurs and most telegraphers were men, we need to talk about their attitudes. Now, agreed, telegraphy opened itself up to women pretty quickly because of the fact that in various parts of the country, they needed operators and they couldn't find enough men, and they opened it up to women. And many women found very good jobs working for Western Union, working for the railroads, etc., just like Mary Macauley did. But in some cases, the men were not happy that they were there. I gotta tell you, even in the 1960s, when I was trying to get into radio, there were still men that didn't want us there. But it wouldn't be fair if I avoided mentioning that there were some men that were fine about women being in amateur radio and in commercial radio. Irving Vermilya, this is a late picture of him, probably in the 1950s, but he was regularly identified as America's #1 ham because, as the story went, he knew Marconi, and he got his first amateur radio license. He got like the one call, maybe. There is some evidence that he did get to meet Marconi when he was 12 years old. Not when Marconi was 12 years old, when Irving was 12 years old. He made a trip with his father, got to meet him, got some radio advice from him in the very, very early days of set building. I think Marconi gave him advice about how to, create a coherer that worked, things like that. But Irving did, in fact, stand in line to get an amateur license in 1912, because after the Radio Act of 1912, you had to be licensed. But he got that first license only in the city he was from. The story was told almost like, well, he was the first in the United States to get a license. Maybe not. But one thing that is true, Irving Vermilya was a legend of amateur radio. He ran a number of ham radio clubs. He was an ambassador for amateur radio. He was 1ZE, later W1ZE. He had a land station. I mean, the man was a wizard, a true star. In 1924, he put a commercial station on the air, WNBH. The call letter stood for the New Bedford Hotel. But before that, he put a station on in his home. Imagine his wife's surprise, WBBG in Mattapoisett. And it broadcast from his home for a while until he finally put WNBH on the air. I'm sure his wife was much happier about that. Before that, he was the engineer and the builder of one of the early radio stations in New Bedford, WDAU. So Irving had a long career in broadcasting. When he first heard Eunice Randall, and of course this was Morse code, so he didn't know whether she was male or female, but he made the assumption that she was male. And she was really a newbie at sending out Morse code. She had just built her first set, and it was a pretty primitive thing. I've got her writings. But he heard her Morse code and basically just kind of mocked it. Basically said something along the lines of, well, little boy, you certainly don't know how to do code, do you? And Eunice, who never took any stuff from anyone, said, I'm not a little boy, I'm a young lady. And if you think my Morse code is bad, you should teach me how to do it right. By all accounts, and I'm told that is not an apocryphal story, Irving was embarrassed, and he decided that he would become her mentor, her Elmer, as it were, and thus developed a more than 4 decades long friendship. And that's all it was, oh, my brothers and sisters. There are many people that would like to say, oh, we know what was going on with it. No. He kind of regarded Eunice as the daughter he never had. And they traveled the country promoting amateur radio. Even though both of them had their foot in commercial broadcasting, their hearts were in amateur radio. As I often mention, and I'll mention it here too, in Irving's later years, he felt like he was kind of pushed aside by commercial radio. New owners took over the station. He was ill. He was alone. He felt that the people he had helped over the years, other than Eunice, didn't keep in touch. And in the end, he died at his own hand. And as I say often, if you know some of the older amateurs, go visit them. Send them an email, make a phone call, let them know that you appreciate their contributions. I found out about these folks, Eunice and Irving, way too late. So my way of saying thank you now is to make sure that their memories live on. And what Irving did for Eunice was a lot more than improve her Morse code. He basically created the space for her to walk in and show what she could do. He wrote an article in 1921 in QST, the influential ham magazine, where he basically told the guys in amateur radio clubs, hey, if women want to participate, so much the better. And that was a very unusual attitude for 1921. And I'm glad that Irving was the mentor to Eunice Randall, because both of them went on to do really important things in amateur radio, and I'm grateful for that. One other person I want to mention, it's the guy in this picture. That's Bob Zimmerman, standing next to his wife, Marie. And the picture was taken in 1930, but it came from their family, and it's the only one they had, and I'm very grateful I have anything, seriously. Marie Zimmerman and her husband, Bob, put on a radio station in Vinton, Iowa in 1922. Now, I know what you're thinking. Yeah, Bob put it on and Marie worked in the... Nope. Marie Zimmerman was the first woman in the United States to own and operate a radio station. But she got her start in amateur radio. She got apprenticed into it by her brother, who came to visit and said, "Hey, just found out this new thing called ham radio. What do you think?" And Marie hadn't thought about it because she wasn't familiar with it. And so he taught it to her, and she became fascinated. Marie's husband, Bob, was the city electrician. He was often called Zim. And he knew that Marie was fascinated by radio. Now, radio broadcasting is just becoming a thing in 1920, 1921. But Bob, who is a builder, there's a great pun there, Bob the Builder, isn't that a children's story? But he really was. He kind of found a way to sort of jury rig a portable radio in their car, which a lot of people were doing in 1921 because there's no car radios yet, no. But a lot of folks that like broadcasting are trying to find a way to transmit from their car and receive from their car. And Bob put a very primitive set in their car. And Marie started talking about, wouldn't it be interesting to have a radio station, like a commercial radio station? And Bob was like, I can build that. He needed money though. It cost $300. They were just a working class couple. $300 might have been like $30,000. So Bob went to the newspaper and it was sort of like, help my wife get a radio station. And it worked. Donations came in and Bob started building. And the next thing you knew, in July of 1922, WIAE went on the air in Vinton, Iowa. Now, if you've never heard of it, you're not alone, because Vinton, Iowa had never heard of it. When I got in touch with their public library, they were like, really? But yeah, the first radio station owned and operated by a woman went on the air in the summer of 1922 in Vinton, Iowa. Marie is identified as Mrs. Robert Zimmerman, as women were identified back then if they were married by the name of their husband. But Bob was very clear with the newspapers because they'd come and try to interview him. And he was like, nah, I just built it. Bye, I'm gone, okay? It's my wife's station, see ya. And so it was. He even put a radio station receiver and transmitter in their truck so that she could drive around the city and promote the station. And she did. It was one of the first stations in Iowa to have campaigning for office by radio. A couple of candidates gave political talks. Now, again, that sounds like, to us, in 1922, people were like, I'm hearing a politician while I'm sitting in my house. They did local music, jazz, dance music, classical. Local musicians got a place to play. Now, I'd like to tell you that the station had a long and prosperous, it did not. If you were an individual entrepreneur back then, you were lucky if you could last a year because it was expensive and commercials were a no-no back then. And while we just don't like commercials, they provided the revenue. And back then, commercials were not allowed, okay? In fact, little 1XE WGI tried to broadcast a commercial in April of 1922, and the radio inspector took a very dim view of it and told them they'd be fined if they ever did that again. So unless you had deep pockets, like KDKA, which was operated by Westinghouse, or WBZ, which was also operated by Westinghouse, it was very difficult to keep your station on the air. Marie's little station just lasted a year, but I'm very glad that it existed. I'm delighted I was able to tell the story. In fact, I'm delighted that I've been able to tell all of these stories. And again, the privilege for me is writing some of these men and women back into history, because without them, the amateur radio game would not have been as interesting, and the commercial radio game would not have been as interesting, because so many of the early broadcasters even the singers, even the accompanists, they studied amateur radio. Some of them maintained that tie till the day they died. It is my privilege to tell their stories. I hope you found this interesting. Thank you.